let's get started, because we're going to cover the entire world before and after the election today. And I do have quite a few people to thank. I'm going to keep it short, and I'm also going to keep the introductions to our panelists short. Let me see. Yes, I'm going to keep the introduction to the panelists short, even though each one of them would require several minutes of introduction. But of course, again, since it is a panel and we have several presenters here, my introduction to them will be rather short. Okay. Looking for my notes. Did my notes fall out? I think I can wing it, even without my notes. Are my notes there? No, it isn't.
That's mine.
Well, let me start out by thanking people while I'm going through my mess here. And maybe I'll have to ask the, no, here we go, I've got it, very good. First of all, let me say I'm so glad to see so many people show up, because foreign affairs, as we know, doesn't tend to attract a lot of discussion when it comes to elections. In fact, the Council on Foreign Affairs has recently published a study that shows that, once again, foreign affairs is just not at the top of the priority list for voters. And instead, of course, there are these issues that are domestic on paper, the economy, inflation. I was also glad to see that at the very top of the list were the democratic institutions, preserving the democratic institutions in the United States. And immigration, of course, was all the way up there. Without a doubt, all of these topics are, of course, directly related to foreign affairs. Our discussion today will allow us to delve into the question of what is it that people's, how significant are people's opinions when it comes to shaping the policy platforms of the two candidates, Harris and Trump, and how do the two very different perspectives on the U.S.'s role in the world, on the value of our traditional allies, on the value of preserving human rights around the world, how are these different perspectives enticing voters to get more involved in foreign affairs? It's a very broad topic, but it is an important one, because, of course, foreign affairs feeds into all of the other topics that are at the top of the priority list of voters. Let me briefly spend a few minutes to thank everyone who was involved in making this event possible. At the top of the list is Professor Emeritus Richard Reitano, who has dedicated his life to giving his students here, and he started in 1966, and he's here. Would you mind? You don't need to get up, because I know. I cannot overstate the influence that Professor Reitano has had on this institution and on the students and his colleagues. So thank you very much. It is due to Professor Reitano's generosity that we have been able to host the event. I'd also like to thank a small local chapter of the World Affairs Council, which has been intrinsically involved in organizing this event. If you're here, you're interested in foreign affairs, if you're not already a member, please consider becoming a member. Information is available outside. Pick up a flyer, take a look at it, and come on board. Let me also give a shout out to another local organization, United Nations Association. There's also information out there. It's another organization that looks at foreign affairs, and it's very much focused on engaging students in particular. These two organizations should and are working closely with each other to engage the community and students in the area on these issues. Now, without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. Unfortunately, one of the panelists who was mentioned on the flyer had to cancel last minute. Joe Collins from the NDU, the National Defense University. Usually these kinds of last minute cancellations cause a major challenge to make the event what it's supposed to be, but this time it wasn't a challenge at all because our moderator, Richard Levitt, Professor Levitt here has the exact expertise that we need to fill in for Joe Collins because he truly is an expert on European affairs. Professor Levitt spent 10 years with the US Department of State, the East-West Institute, and the Center for European Security Studies. In addition, Professor Levitt spent 25 years with international investment banks. He is completing his second year as a board member of the World Affairs Council of the Mid-Hudson Valley, and he's been teaching international relations at the NYU Center for Global Affairs since 2009. Please welcome Professor Levitt. Malia Demont is Chief of Staff and Vice President for Strategy and Policy at Bard College. Previously, she held multiple policy positions in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and on the Joint Staff, including as Director of Strategy. She covered Southwest Asian issues as an Army Reserve Intelligence Officer on deployment in Afghanistan and at NATO. She's fluent in Mandarin, as well as in many other languages, as I just found out. She began her career at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she managed the school's China initiative. She also spent several years analyzing Chinese military strategy and doctrine at the CNA Corporation. She has worked in China as an English teacher, a news editor at a provincial TV station, and in the Defense Attaché Office.
Yes.
In the American Embassy in Beijing. She also chairs the Veterans Advisory Committee for Congressman Pat Ryan and is on the boards of the American University of Afghanistan and the World Affairs Council Mid-Hudson Valley. Please join me in greeting Malia, who's a very busy person, and we're so grateful that she was able to make it today. James Ketterer is a senior fellow at the Bard Center for Civic Engagement. At Bard, he was previously Dean of International Studies. He previously served as Dean of the School of Continuing Education at the American University in Cairo and Egypt, Country Director for Amid East, the American Educational NGO. He was also a Boren Fellow in Morocco and a Rotary Ambassadorial Fellow in Tunisia. He served in government on the state and federal levels, including in Near East, South Asia Directorate at the National Security Council. Well, welcome. With that, let's dive right into the panel discussion. Let's start with Professor Levitt to give us his perspective on the relationship, the intersection between the upcoming elections and foreign affairs.
First, I have to apologize. I'm pinch hitting for Joe Collins, who is the smartest man I know. So anything that I do is going to actually fall short. So I'm just going to start with that. I take the position that relations with and events in Europe are the best shorthand way of understanding the exercise of American influence today. And that's both looking at it over the long term, what I call the sort of the transatlantic nexus, and right now the immediate problem, the situation in Ukraine. But before I go into that, I want to interpose something that maybe comes from the 25 years of misguided adulthood spent on Wall Street. Between 1945 and 1970, the U.S. economy on most measures was bigger than the rest of the world's combined. Since 1970, the U.S. has continued to grow and often grows very strongly, but its relative share of global output has declined. Today, it's somewhat around 25%. This has occurred as the rise of the rest, Fareed Zakaria's term, has taken place as other industrial nations regain their stride post the Second World War, or actually hit it for the first time in the case of what we used to call the lesser developed countries. Use economic growth, GDP growth, as a sort of a metaphor for political heft. And you can see where I'm going. How well this organic shift, this decline, is understood underpins what I call the psychological platforms of We Are the World, Kamala Harris, and America First, Donald Trump. Now, there are a couple of observations here that I don't think are terribly controversial no matter where you stand politically. The long-term nexus. Even in the immediate post-war period, the transatlantic connection was seen as a critical market or marketplace for what I call American economic and political output. And not merely a marketplace, but a sort of a force multiplier. And maybe this is best exemplified in the Marshall Plan. Or when we think about NATO, which, by the way, was a European and not an American invention. Their development is sort of emblematic of this shared desire for the triumph of democratic political values and market capitalist or maybe social democratic economic values. But broadly speaking, it would be a frictionless way of dealing with this large group of nations. That's the long-term issue. The immediate issue today, Ukraine. And no matter where you are on the political spectrum, I think you could say or would agree that Russian success in Ukraine would have immediate ramifications for the European security situation. It would certainly be an aggrandizement of the Russian position, and it would probably lead to general systemic instability. It also has implications for the general conduct of international relations broadly, as well as a very specific precedent set for Taiwan. So those are the ways Europe factors to both Donald Trump and to Kamala Harris. From Trump's perspective, the Europeans have long gotten a free ride on security and other issues. So this transatlantic nexus is to him nothing positive. He sees them as free riders. He, as recently as February of this year, invited Russia to do whatever they want to do with NATO nations that don't pull their own weight economically. He has said he would apply tariffs on all imported goods across the board. This would include European nations. Nations that he would nevertheless expect to line up with him in his conflict with China. So there's no incentive there. He's punishing them, but he expects them to be on his side of the other great debate going on in the world. In respect of Ukraine specifically, I think the most charitable way we can characterize his view is it's not our fight. But the inconsistent transactional way in which he speaks it and has manifested makes it very, very difficult to communicate it as a cogent whole, and more importantly, to understand it as a cogent whole. What Trump needs to understand and I think his supporters need to understand this as well, is that the rules of the international road, the sort of the formal and informal rules of the international road, are largely American, almost exclusively American in authorship, starting in 1945. You can impose your rules, rules that benefit you, at the point of a gun, or you can try to create, with a broad idea of what actually is the cost and what is the benefit, a system where people buy in. Joseph Nye coined the term soft power, and that is getting people to want what you want. A more cynical way, get people to want what you want them to want. But it is not at the point of a gun. The alternative is to walk away and remove any kind of incentive for cooperation in a world where cooperation is increasingly necessary. If you will, Trump thinks in pre-1970 terms, when the US economy was so big that he thought that we could dictate and people would pay attention. So I think that's the overarching problem there. Specifically, on the question of US forces in Europe and elsewhere, every host nation has paid a huge part of the cost, something he either doesn't know or has conveniently forgotten. And this is willing acknowledgement on the part of these host nations to bear a good portion of the cost of their security. And specifically on Ukraine, even if Russian conquest of it was not antithetic to Trump's idea of national security, and I can't imagine why it wouldn't be, because just the financial costs that would be consequential have to factor. But even if they didn't, certainly the example for China, with it then invading Taiwan, a stranglehold on production of semiconductor chips, consolidation in the South and East China Seas. These are clearly antithetic to what he believes is America's rightful place and control of the world. So that's the Trump angle. Kamala Harris, by way of Joe Biden, believes that this broad nexus, the transatlantic nexus, is a time-honored example of the rules-based international system. And NATO, for example, is a constitutional expression of that, expression of those shared values. She does think that U.S. needs allies diplomatically and militarily. And in thinking that actually dates back to Richard Nixon and virtually every president since Nixon, understands that the U.S. alone cannot control events, that it needs alliances, formal and otherwise, to help affect its writ. Using the metaphor from the economics, this is post-1970s thinking. On Russia, she is a stern critic of Putin generally, and on Ukraine specifically. She would be unlikely as president, though, to exceed the cautious approach that Joe Biden has exhibited in trying not to let the conflict escalate. Her chief national security advisor, a man named Phil Gordon, is very much an Obama-Biden policy wonk. So there would be a fair amount of continuity there. What Kamala Harris needs explained to her, her big problem, inherited from Biden and from many of their predecessors, is that these sacred cows of the American take on international relations are so deeply ingrained psychologically that nobody seems to feel the need, to understand the need, to really explain them. If you will, zero-based budgeting, starting from the building blocks and convincing people that they are still valid, that they were valid once, and that they remain valid. You think of FDR, you think of Ronald Reagan, who were both incredibly patient explainers of policy in terms that were not soaring rhetoric, but were nuts and bolts over a long period of time, very patiently building cases for their policies. This is not what you see with Kamala Harris. You certainly didn't see it with Joe Biden. And it is something that is sorely, sorely needed. To the degree the U.S.-Europe relationship is emblematic of globalized dealing, so many Americans have been left behind that she's associated with policies that have truly disadvantaged large and vocal portions of the American electorate. And specifically on Ukraine, how do you differentiate for your traditional electoral base? How do you differentiate Israel's actions in Gaza from what Russia is doing in Ukraine? This is not just an academic exercise. This is something that speaks to political dynamics, electoral dynamics. So Trump's and Harris's positions and their supporters' positions are 180 degrees opposed. And this isn't simply rhetoric. They are based on very different perceptions of the world. He draws the wrong lessons from a set of precepts that never existed, that America was actually able to dictate things and have people pay attention, yes sir, 3 bags full. And hers is based on a very broad definition that takes itself for granted and doesn't understand just how much of current international dealing really disadvantages and is not understood by a large part of the American electorate. So I've taken much too much time. I'll hand over.
Right. Thanks. Well, I am here to talk about farther to the east, the United States and China. So the future of the world, to a large extent, is going to be dictated by how these two nations interact with each other. Right? The largest militaries in the world, the largest economies in the world, the 2 largest polluters in the world as well. And the relationship over the past several years, as you've no doubt noticed, has been characterized by rising tensions between the 2 countries, but also a heightened level of tension in the region, in the East Asia region, between China and a lot of its neighbors. A lot of this comes back to trade competitions, and a lot of it is based on territorial disputes. So it's obviously really important to the future of the world how the United States leads our part in this relationship after the next election. It's going to determine what is the correct balance between competition and cooperation between the United States and China, because there's always been a mix of those things in the relationship. What are the implications for the regional alliances that the United States has? Some of our most important alliances are throughout the Indo-Pacific region, as it's now officially called in U.S. policy. And then, of course, Taiwan, which is, I don't think we're on the brink of war there, but it's clearly a major flashpoint in the world. Now, despite the fact that, as I've just said, the relationship between these 2 nations is going to determine, to a large extent, the future of the world. And also, we've all noticed that our 2 presidential candidates are vastly different in their approaches to just about everything. The fact is that the one area where they are probably least different from each other is on their approach to China. So if you look back at the Trump administration national security strategy from 2017, the way it talks about China as a threat, as a competitor, very, very similar language in the Biden administration national security strategy, which also identified China as a threat, a major strategic challenge. There's an unusual and currently uncommon level of bipartisan agreement in DC about the dangers of China. Some of those, I can say as someone who spent a lot of time in China, and I go there every year, some of the dangers, I believe, are exaggerated for political reasons on both sides. That's not surprising. But the fact is that there is right now kind of a degree of agreement and continuity between Republicans and Democrats as to how they view China. So we're going to see, no matter who gets elected as president, a high level of tension and probably increased levels of competition, especially in certain areas that really define national power. So the economy. Donald Trump was a fan of tariffs, was sort of almost gleeful about starting a trade war with China, but the Biden administration has imposed even more tariffs. They've taken some of them back from the Trump administration, but they've put other ones in place. And so whether it's Harris or Trump, you're going to continue to see tariffs used as a way to regulate economic competition with China and take a protectionist approach to U.S. economic growth, especially when it comes to high tech, clean energy, and all kinds of innovation. You mentioned semiconductors, so that's one of the key aspects of competition. Trying to protect and uplift the U.S. semiconductor industry is something that is a foreign policy issue now with China in particular. We're going to continue to see military buildup by the Chinese, and the United States has been saying for over a decade now, under both the Democratic and Republican candidates, that there's going to be a stronger U.S. military presence in the Asia Pacific, and that has been building. And it takes slightly different forms under different administrations. So under the Biden administration, and one presumes that Harris would probably continue this, there's a big emphasis on continuing and strengthening the really important alliances we have in the area: Japan, Korea, Australia. And now also this mutual defense agreement we have with the Philippines. There's going to continue to be competition around the world for diplomatic influence. China has taken a very activist role through, many of you probably heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, as a way to expand their economic impact, but it's also, it has diplomatic effects as well. Human rights issues, I doubt that Donald Trump is going to make that a centerpiece of his foreign policy if he's elected. Kamala Harris has talked about human rights with regard to Uyghurs, other minority groups in China, but if she's president, then I doubt it will be the centerpiece of American foreign policy towards China. It's going to be about this competition for global influence, and specifically to what degree can we regulate the level of tension in East Asia in particular. I think there'll be some differences between the candidates on the margins. So if Harris is president, then there will probably be more opportunity for people-to-people exchanges. I don't think that if President Trump is reelected, that he would care very much about that. Similarly, I don't think that he's going to be emphasizing any kind of potential environmental cooperation with China that might be possible under a Harris administration, because the Chinese have been really concerned about environmental issues. Global public health, another area where there could be room for dialogue. But again, on these sort of, I mean, they're very important to all of us, but in terms of American foreign policies towards China, they're marginal. So even if Harris is more activist in those areas than Trump would be, they're not going to take center stage in terms of how this bilateral relationship develops. The biggest changes I think we would see aren't necessarily in the bilateral relationship, it'd be regionally. So as I mentioned, and as we've seen in Europe, Trump is not a fan of, or doesn't feel beholden to sort of traditional alliance structures. And of course, the U.S. alliances with Korea, with Japan, with Australia are longstanding, very strong, and they help underpin stability in the East Asia region. So how would Trump, how would he change those relationships? He didn't undo them during his previous term, but I don't think he would want to rely on them as much, and he would probably complain that Japan isn't pulling its weight, for example, either the same way he complains about NATO. One thing I want to make sure to mention is that in Beijing, they also don't see much difference between the candidates. So the various sources of Chinese press I've been paying attention to, they don't really, they're not rooting for one side or the other necessarily. They think that they're gonna run into more tariffs from the United States, no matter who is elected. That we see a more protectionist America that from the Chinese point of view is not as pro-free trade as we like to say that we are. And they see a lot of bipartisan, what they would characterize as anti-China debate and rhetoric. And so the view from Beijing is that it's more or less the same in terms of policy. Personalities is a different thing. Even though Trump sees a lot of economic competition with China, the admiration that he has expressed for other authoritarian figures in the world lends itself to Xi Jinping as well as the strongest leader China's had in decades. So a couple things I'm going to be paying attention to that I consider, I mean, wild cards is maybe too strong a term. It implies that they could really change outcomes of things in a major way, but it'll be interesting to watch what Tim Walz's role will be, because he has a long history in going to China. He went there for the first time in 1989. He's been there over 30 times. He's taken student groups there. He was on the Congressional Executive Committee on China, Commission on China in Congress, and he's been a really strong and consistent voice, a very nuanced voice on China. And so what kind of influence he might have is something I think could be really interesting. Now, traditionally, vice presidents don't have a lot of influence in foreign policy, but if Harris is elected, perhaps Tim Walz, given his special background in China, would have an unusual role. I've seen some press talk about the fact that the head of Harris's transition team is a current U.S. ambassador to ASEAN and therefore is posted in Jakarta. Somehow that is an indication that her administration is going to be more focused on the Asia Pacific. I think that's not correct. The fact is this guy also headed the Biden transition team, so I think they're just picking the same guy who's done it before because he has the experience. I'm not sure it really indicates some special focus on Southeast Asia. And Harris herself, it's unclear. I don't think she's going to have a huge departure from Biden if she's elected, but there's still space for her to develop her own way forward. And to what extent would she differ from Biden? It's really still unclear. Now, her main foreign policy expert is, as Rick says, Phil Gordon. He's a Middle East expert, so that indicates perhaps that she's not going to have a big focus on the Asia Pacific. It's just not well understood at this point. So those are some points I just want to start with, sort of lay the context and some of the things that I'm looking at to help me understand, how this might play out. But I think the bottom line is people in Beijing don't see much difference in what's going to happen under either president. And frankly, neither of the candidates has really laid out a starkly different approach towards China from each other either.
Thank you.
Well, it's difficult to follow those two great presentations. As Malia was speaking, I was thinking about how I might adjust what I'm talking about. I was asked to come here and talk about the Middle East, and hearing her talk about these two global entities facing off, enormous budgets, massive firepower, the people involved, and supportive, inspired to back their sides no matter what, often very, very vigorously. Of course, I'm talking about the Yankees and the Dodgers. That might be better to analyze that instead of the Middle East, but I will talk about the Middle East for a little bit, at least. First, I want to just thank Dutchess Community College and the World Affairs Council. And Professor Reitano had, at a dinner just before this event, was quoting two of the Kennedys. And, all of you who are here, you could be doing many different things tonight, and you've decided to be here and engage these issues. And here at the college, the World Affairs Council, the UN Association, and other similar organizations, I've been going around the country these past few months speaking to other world affairs groups and American committees on foreign relations. It's so critically important that people do get involved in these issues, and that these kinds of things are not just reserved for a few people in government and in think tanks and in universities and in Washington or Paris or London or Berlin. These are critically important issues, so I applaud you for doing it. For students who are in the audience, and I hope there are some that you might go back, even as we're here in this moment in the 2024 elections, go back and listen to John Kennedy's inaugural address in early 1961 and his call to action. And I think it's as important now as it ever was. So thank you for being here, and please do stay involved in these issues, no matter how depressing what I'm about to say is. When you just look at the situation in the Middle East, those issues that are in the news and in the headlines, and those that we'll talk about that are not quite so prominent but still are important, one wonders why anyone would want to be president and inherit this. It is really, I've been dealing with, living in, working on the Middle East for quite a long time, and this is a very, very difficult moment. Malia was talking about Phil Gordon and his career on Middle East issues, but American administrations have been trying to move away from the Middle East for some administrations, the pivot away, and it's never really worked. It's like that scene from, I think it's Godfather 2, where it just keeps pulling me back in, and that the Obama administration tried very, very hard, and they spoke out loud about it, which I think undermined the effort in many ways. So I think that administrations come, administrations go. It feels now in this, in these few days leading up to this momentous election that everything is at stake. And I think people often assume that with foreign policy issues, particularly related to the Middle East, that when you get a new president, a new administration around that president, perhaps a new party or a continuation of the old party, that there's going to be massive changes. And that just has not been the case with the Middle East for a long time. Now, some of the details change, but the core interests that are at the base of our policy have remained the same. And so whether you like it or not, that here they are. So maintaining the safety and security of Israel, maintaining the free navigation of the waterways for trade, for the U.S. Navy, for the navies of our allies, and there's a variety of maritime choke points. And in a world in which it appears that everything is so super high-tech and is done with a flip of a switch and the flight of a drone, navies still matter. And they still matter very much in the Middle East. And the third is boxing out any of our adversaries in the region. Back in the days of the Cold War, or at least the first Cold War, that largely meant the Soviet Union. And it means different things now, but still Russia, China to a certain extent, sometimes even countries that are our allies, like Britain and France, as it relates to weapons sales, which is a major activity in the region. So those things have not changed. They have not changed for a very long time. And then the question is, what details change around those core things? Now, it's not to say that they can't change or they would never change. I'm just saying they haven't for quite a long time. I think it's useful for us to discuss this evening and beyond, well, might there be some things happening in this election? Might there be some things happening on the ground in the Middle East that would in fact start to change some of the nature of those interests? But it hasn't so far. So I'm not saying that the election doesn't matter. I'm saying we have to put in context what is likely to change and what is likely not to change. Obviously, the situation in Gaza since October 7th of last year has dominated the news, dominated the bandwidth of the U.S. government and many more, and had real effects on the conduct of the campaign. We heard in the introductions that oftentimes foreign policy is not seen as something that's critically important in an election, even a presidential election. But it could well be the case that important states, particularly Michigan, may be deeply affected by the percentage of Arab voters there who are profoundly upset with the current policy, U.S. policy on Israel-Gaza. And so is that going to have a longer-term effect on the nature of politics as it plays out in the United States or not? Campus protests. Anybody who thought that this was going to be, something that happened last academic year and it's over, I think we're quickly proven wrong. This is a longer-standing issue, and it's one that's manifesting itself in lots of different ways with regard to the election and beyond the election itself. So those things, I think, really do dominate the news, but they're not the only things at play. And in a sense, it feels that everything is sort of interconnected in the Middle East, and it is in a way, and it is for U.S. foreign policy. And there's some things that maybe are standalone issues, but the situation with Iran and Iran's relationship with Hamas, Iran's relationship with Hezbollah, and now the fighting that's going on in Lebanon, Iran's relationship with the Houthis. Iran's relationship with its own foreign policy as a revolutionary actor that continues to disrupt the system is something that the next president is going to inherit in a big way. I don't know, it wouldn't be a wild card and that it would be a huge surprise, but I think that what happens with Iran, what happens between Israel and Iran, what also happens between Saudi Arabia and Iran will be something that will be very much drawing the president back in, no matter how much they might want to pivot out, no matter how much they want to just focus on Asia, the Iran issue will. Now, some of the things that I ticked off, like Lebanon has, Hezbollah in the news and the squaring off of Hezbollah and the Israelis, but it does open up a broader conversation, a U.S. foreign policy conversation about the nature of Lebanon as an entity, a nation state sort of cobbled together, hanging by a thread even before the most recent fighting happened. What happens if Lebanon becomes even more unstable? If it's not just a question of the role of Hezbollah, but the role of the Shia in Lebanon more broadly, in Lebanon and the broader region, it strikes me that this is also going to be very much on the desk of the new president. I mentioned the Houthis. This is a relatively small band of people who are heavily armed and heavily inspired, but really have, the capacity, with Iranian support, but also with their own interests in mind, to bring to almost a halt international shipping. And I mentioned the free navigation, this kind of core interest of the United States, bringing that shipping to a halt and having shipping then having to go all the way around the southern tip of Africa has massive effects, strategic effects, trade effects, economic effects. That's another thing that's going to draw people back in. One thing that it has episodic appearance in the news, but I think will be a constant drumbeat of a problem, will be our relationship with Turkey. And the State Department doesn't put Turkey in the Near Eastern Affairs region, but I'll hereby declare that for tonight it's in. And Turkey is a NATO member, but a difficult one, and one that has, purchased weapons from the Russians, one whose policies have been antithetical in general to U.S. policy and interests in the region, and problematic. And there's a lot kind of on the boil in Turkey that could pop up at any moment, and I think also be on the desk of the president. A couple other things that maybe aren't really in the news at all, but still retain all kinds of power to draw the U.S. attention back in and be highly problematic. Libya. Libya continues to be an absolute chaotic mess, one that is created by the intervention of NATO, and one that is also on the list of grievances from the Russians, who feel like we tricked them into being tacitly supportive of the operation to initially go in there. It was supposed to be under the heading of responsibility to protect the citizens of Benghazi in the east, and turned into something quite different, a regime change operation, the death of Gaddafi, and the descent of the country into the chaotic situation in which it still stays. One horrible situation that's some people might include in the Middle East, some won't, perhaps, but I will tonight, because it has all kinds of regional implications, is the ongoing fighting in Sudan that is drawing in many different actors, many of them Middle Eastern, and is absolutely horrific, terribly bloody, and has the potential to draw in the Egyptians, the Emiratis. It has drawn them in already, but into things that could escalate into other other conflicts that are already going on, like with the Egyptians and the Ethiopians and others. On the southern edge of the Sahara, the Sahel area, where the French have really largely lost the influence they had, post-colonial influence for a long time, where you see really pointed, acute Russian influence through what's now left of the Wagner Group, where the U.S. has had kind of a on and off, not very effective policy or presence for a long time, also has the potential to blow up. I just want to mention a couple of other things before we turn it over to the next phase of questions and answers and baseball analysis. One is, this is not just a presidential election year. And foreign policy is not just run by the executive side of the operation. And who gets elected to Congress and what their actions are going to be matters a lot. And this is an area that, circle back to what I was saying at the beginning about citizen engagement in foreign policy. This is where citizens and localities really can have an effect with your local member of Congress and say, what is your policy on these things that we're talking about today, or some other issue that you might feel very strongly about. And we have seen that, for instance, the Egyptian government knows very well that Congress has and particularly the Senate, has a very important role in the conduct of American foreign policy. So they realized this and decided that they were going to give stacks of lots of money and gold bars to Senator Menendez when he was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Why did they want to peddle that kind of influence? There's also an assumption, there's an assertion alleged that Donald Trump accepted $10 million from Egyptian intelligence in 2016. And the Washington Post ran a long expose on this. It hasn't really been followed up, but the broader point is, if you think it's just those couple of cases, you're wrong. There are a lot of foreign intelligence agencies, including from across the Middle East, who are seeking targets of opportunity and taking advantage of them. These are just a couple that, one that's alleged, one that has been convicted and removed from office that we know about. I guarantee you there's a lot of money washing around Washington into think tanks, into the pockets of all kinds of people who they seek to influence, and they're putting that money in because they think that influence matters. So if it matters to our adversaries, or in some cases our supposed allies who are doing this, I think it ought to matter to all of us and pay close attention to what's going on in Congress. Another thing where I think, and it's true with China and it's true with what's going on in Europe and particularly Ukraine, but so just a couple of general things I would say is, one thing that a new administration is going to have to really grapple with is not just the ideas of what might constitute new policies or the maintenance of old policies, but the linking of those ideas with actual capacity. And this is where we have really fallen down, particularly in the Middle East, over the last few decades. The idea to invade, occupy, and transform Iraq, one could debate that idea vigorously, but I think we could also see, it turns out that the people who decided to do this didn't have the capacity or couldn't muster up and organize the capacity in a way that was really going to be effective. Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We have seen really massive mistakes made in the failure to kind of organize and execute, and not just think big thoughts, but do big things and do them right. And so I think that's going to be a very important thing that a new administration is going to have to deal with, and certainly in the areas that I'm focused on diplomacy. The State Department is perpetually underfunded. They're always begging for money compared to the Pentagon. Robert Gates once said that, and he was right in pointing out, there are more musicians in the military than there are diplomats. And he wasn't arguing for fewer musicians, who, by the way, are great. I come from a family of musicians, so I'm not arguing for fewer musicians. He was saying we need more diplomats. And then the phrase, if you don't get more diplomats, you're going to have to buy me more ammunition. And so how can we bolster the capacity of these institutions to not just kind of do the things that end up on the front page of the New York Times, negotiations in a conference room or something, but the day-to-day activity of embassies, the kinds of soft power things that Joseph Nye talked about, don't happen by themselves. You need people, you need structures, you need processes, you need funding to make them happen and to be effective. So with that, I'll end it. Hopefully it wasn't too depressing, and we can move on to some Q&A.
I had a student once who at the end of the semester said, I came into this class with the intention of pursuing a career in international relations, but I realized that the topics are too frustrating and depressing. We're going to open up to Q&A soon. I would like to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to each other. But before I do, I one question. I have a whole list of questions, but the message that has permeated throughout the three fabulous, by the way, thank you so much, fabulous presentations, is a feeling that liberalist perspectives, liberalist ideology, the idea that long-term peace can be real if if we build up trade relations, it seems to be dead. China, in 2002, I believe it was, when China acceded to the WTO, the assumption was that through international trade relations, China would be integrated and we would see changes in human rights. Long-term Chancellor Merkel in Germany dedicated much of her career to cooperating with Russia, so trade relations. There are numerous factors to it, but she's now being criticized for having been too trusting and blamed much for the challenges that we're seeing in Europe now. And of course, in the Middle East as well, just before October 7th, where it looked like Israel was going to have a different standing in the region because of its growing relationships with the powers in the Middle East. Why has this, I guess my simple question is, why have we seen the death of liberalist thinking over the last 2 decades? Thank you.
The triumph of experience over hope, I guess. Instinctively, I want to say that the liberal idea, or what is pejoratively sometimes called the neoliberal idea, they get conflated, but there is enough overlap, was probably oversold. Not wrong, but oversold, as is the way of most politicians. Don't understate it. You scare the hell out of people or you overpraise them. I doubt people really thought China was going to become democratic, having joined the WTO. I can't imagine any real China observer, or for that matter, serious politician, believing that was really what was going to happen. Something was going to get nudged. But China was not going to become a democratic state. It had to be sold this way, however, to get support. Oversimplified, oversold, overpackaged. And I think that is the essence of the problem, rather than that the liberal impulse about closer relationships being a good thing was wrong, that it was not well enough understood by many of its proponents, but worse, was sold incorrectly, and it has created a lot of disappointment amongst the talking heads, disappointment amongst the public, the people who were supposed to benefit by it. We were all supposed to benefit from globalization. Well, nobody thought about the implications of what happened when jobs went overseas. Well, it was a good thing because we were going to get cheaper goods. Well, okay, but what do you do about unemployment? It was brushed away. Like I say, wishful thinking, perhaps, but that didn't mean the original goal was the wrong one. I don't know.
So I had a front row seat to this debate playing out inside the government. I left government in 2015, and that was for the final year I was in the Pentagon. A lot of my time was taken up participating in meetings, discussions, dialogues, memo writing, et cetera, about the approach to China. And there was still a big divide, even inside the Pentagon at that time, between people who thought that engagement is going to lead to China becoming more of a responsible stakeholder. That was the phrase that's used, that the more you pull China into things like the WTO, other international organizations, that they're going to become bound in a positive way from the American perspective, bound by the rules that govern these organizations and would start to act in a way that supports the current liberal international order. Now, that didn't happen, right? Since 2002, China being in the WTO hasn't lessened the economic competition between the US and China. Now, you could argue, well, if for this kind of effort to succeed, you have to have a really comprehensive approach. It's not enough just to bring China in the WTO and think, oh, magically they're suddenly going to be in favor of the current version of the liberal international order. It takes coordinated diplomacy and every other tool in the government toolbox working together. But I just think it was naive to think that even if the government invested equally in all those different areas of policy in an attempt to really make sure that China did become a responsible stakeholder from a Western perspective, that's not the way that nations have behaved with each other throughout history. When one empire is rising, another one is falling. I mean, these are the kinds of, like, the rising empire doesn't suddenly decide, oh, I want to help out this empire that's sort of on its way out, or it's like weaker now. They of course they want to make sure that things are as much in their favor as possible. So it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that China has engaged in a concerted effort to redefine or refine the international system in a way that's more favorable to them. And they've done that in a lot of ways that aren't on the front pages of the newspapers. They've taken a real leading role in a lot of international bodies that govern, like, AI safety and other, like, technology-related things. And the U.S. has ceded those conversations to the Chinese in a lot of ways. We're just not participating in them to the same extent. So I think it's, to answer your question, I think it's the way that nations interact, and you can believe in the liberal international order, but to think that it sort of naturally, magically perpetuates itself without any kind of tension is deeply naive. And I think that's what happened inside U.S. government in the mid-2010s. Right after I left government, those kinds of debates really resolved themselves. And since then, in the late 2010s and now, there really isn't that debate inside government anymore. I think we've all seen the result of that. There's, as I said before, there's this pretty much bipartisan consensus that you can't hug China enough to make the tension go away. That you have to plan for a contentious relationship. Planning for it doesn't mean that you want it to be contentious, but the fact is that the United States and China have different interests, and there's no way around that, no matter how active they are in the WTO or the WHO or any other international forum.
So I plead guilty to naivete, particularly as it relates to one particular moment in the Middle East, the end of 2010, the beginning of 2011, the Arab uprisings, the so-called Arab Spring, and I had an opportunity to move to Egypt just at the tail end of the revolution there, which was January and February of 2011. And there was a sense, a prevailing sense in the US government with many people, just I think more of a wish than an analysis, that this was really going to be the Middle East finally catching up with the rest of the world that had, jumped on the end of history bandwagon. And when the Cold War ended and the wall went down, and that it seemed that as naive as it sounds, that democracy was breaking out all over. People were having elections. The world was becoming interconnected in a very positive way, and that the Middle East was now going to finally be catching up, and it was going to be throwing off these, these old, sclerotic, authoritarian regimes. And so there I was on the ground. I got there as that hope was still very much prevalent in the air and across the region. And I was there and then witnessed the first elections that were held that brought together, brought to power the Muslim Brotherhood into parliament and their allies, the Salafis, and whose main job was to write a new constitution, but ended up focusing on things like should we be able to sell beer to foreigners? Should people be able to wear bikinis at the beach? And lots of other very unpleasant things. And you started to see the things ebb away with the hope of this. Eventually led to the election of a Muslim Brotherhood president. That eventually, a year later, led to a military coup, which the United States government decided not to deem a coup, or decided not to speak about it. It decided not to decide. So we weren't just an observer in this, we were an active participant even when we were tacitly participating. And then that coup d'etat was shortly followed by a crackdown of Muslim Brotherhood supporters that killed close to 1,000 people in a square in Cairo in one day. The US did not much. Some said some about it, but not much. The situation now in Egypt and in many other of the Arab states is one that has not only returned to what existed before these uprisings, but in many cases a much worse situation. And in many cases, we see both administrations. The Biden administration came into office saying that human rights was going to be front and center in dealing with some of these difficult regimes in the Middle East. Egypt, by not only the estimation of Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, but its own State Department, its annual report on human rights, is one of the most egregious abusers of human rights on the face of the planet. They are also the second largest recipient of US foreign assistance on the face of the planet. And so that is something that is very much in the hands of our members of Congress as well as administrations. And there was a moment when there was kind of more and more voices being raised about this. Then we had the Menendez scandal. Then we had the October 7th attack and the conflicts that have followed. Not a peep. Not a peep now. So what will the new administration do about that? But as Malia was saying about conversations in the US government about China, I think conversations about the Middle East in the US government have very little to do now. There's some hand-wringing, but beyond that, with about policies that are going to be effective about the support of human rights. Democratization as a word is just completely out of the playbook. Don't even bring it up. So it's not only that it has stalled, I would say those kinds of agendas have gone backwards.
Well, thank you. Let's open up the floor for questions. Dr. Murray. Okay, there's, you know what? I'm going to help out. There is a question over there. All the way up there.
Hi. It sounds like by far, at least from what I was coming into me, or what I was hearing, was that the biggest differences between the administrations it would be Europe, between Europe, U.S., Ukraine situation, as opposed to the other regions, is at least how I heard it. And I'm wondering how those differences, you know, if you fast forward 4 years to the end of this administration, might make things look like in Ukraine, but also how does that change? Because you hear about this in the news, but I'm curious your perspectives, how this might change the situation between China, Taiwan, and the U.S., and how those differences in Europe and Ukraine might change that situation.
My gut tells me that the day it becomes clear that the U.S. and the West more broadly abandons Ukraine, won't say that, but when it becomes clear that that is what has happened, the next day China moves in. It doesn't necessarily mean that China will invade, but it will turn up the screws enough to make invasion not necessary, that its control of Taiwan will be sufficient, that in the very short period of time, Beijing is satisfied. At some point, and maybe it's nothing more than Xi's own amour-propre, his own ego, where it has to become official. The Chinese play the long game. They play the long game better than anybody else on this planet. So, does it have to be de jure sovereignty over Taiwan? Not immediately. I think that the Chinese have watched a surprisingly robust Western response to what has gone on in Ukraine, and I think we have to give Joe Biden a lot of credit for it. I think the Europeans might have wanted to stand up, but absent the U.S. position, probably would not have. So, and I'm not quite sure if this answers your question, but I would say the willingness of the West, specifically the United States, to put its money where its mouth is, makes all the difference right now for Taiwan. I don't know, you would probably have a more sophisticated take on it.
So the Russia-China relationship is extremely complicated. They declared what they call a no-limits partnership in 2022. I agree that China's probably surprised the degree to which there's been Western support for Ukraine. But in the end, I think they actually sort of relish this as an opportunity to challenge the United States in another area. I mean, China is really supporting Russia economically through this current crisis with Ukraine. It's a sort of an easy, low-risk way for them to challenge U.S. leadership in the world. It doesn't mean that Xi Jinping and Putin get along really well, even though they are in Moscow together right now, or maybe Xi just left and went back to Beijing. But they have some common interests when it comes to countering the United States, and Ukraine is a convenient place for China to sort of support that effort. There are, I think a lot of people assume that there are broader lessons to be taken from Ukraine for Taiwan than I think there actually are. There are a couple key differences. One is that Europeans don't care about Taiwan generally. It just doesn't have near the same interest for them as does the United States. Clearly, there's very little implication for NATO. The United States has been working for a long time to try to get Europe to pay more attention to what happens in Indo-Pacific. And the French, they have one of the larger navies in Europe. They've become more interested recently, but really when it comes to Taiwan, it's just the United States and China. That's what it comes down to. There's no, Japan cares about Taiwan, but it doesn't have the same sort of broader implications for a big alliance structure that Ukraine does. And it's also written in the American law that we support Taiwan. So there's this long-standing history here. I think it's true that no matter what happens in Ukraine, Xi Jinping and the People's Liberation Army are continuing to tighten the screws on Taiwan. I mean, they they've been doing major exercises just over the past couple weeks. This is very strange but true, but the Chinese Coast Guard, actually, their patrols around Taiwan, they did it in the shape of a heart. It's like, we're embracing you, our Taiwanese brethren. It's unusual propaganda. But China's goals towards Taiwan are not dependent on what happens in Ukraine. So however Ukraine gets resolved, that will indicate the degree of Western resolve generally, but it doesn't speak specifically to the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, which is a singular thing. And I don't see, unless Donald Trump gets elected and he decides, I love these authoritarians, and so Xi Jinping can do whatever he wants. But he didn't say he didn't indicate that he was going to abandon Taiwan when he was president before. And I think there's such a long-standing history and congressional support for Taiwan that I don't think that you would see some kind of direct mirroring if we abandoned Ukraine, that suddenly we would abandon Taiwan as well. I don't see that parallel to quite the same extent.
I won't speak too long about this because I think on the Middle East, I think we probably would see either new administration, no matter who wins, to maintain those core interests. And I think we would see, at least in the first year or two, a new administration being just reactive to all the many crises that are ongoing already, and some that might pop up that I mentioned, and to be very distracted by all of those. If there is any bandwidth and any inclination to say, okay, now is a moment in the wake of whatever the wake is going to be, to kind of reinvigorate and reconstruct American engagement with the region. I think there's definitely a difference in style and approach, and that the Trump approach we saw in his 4 years in office in the Middle East was very transactional and deal-making, and that it's probably more likely that Harris administration would be more focused on the kind of ongoing institutions that conduct foreign policy for us. In either of those cases, though, will they have the kind of inclination, the patience, and to be able to muster up the capacity I was talking about before to really make it so, and not just have it be an idea, but to put the people and money and relationships in place that would really do that. And I think that's a tough thing for, particularly if you're in the second half of an administration, to do. So I think it'll be kind of steady state with the interests and reactive to the crises in either case.
Thank you. Trump didn't plan on winning in 2016. He didn't think he was going to win. So there was no overriding foreign policy. He's made it clear now that he is going to, by default, many of the traditional diplomats stayed in place. The bureaucracy stayed in place. He's made it clear now that he's not going to leave the traditional diplomats in place. Does that make it more difficult to predict what he will do? I mean, Harris is going to be a traditional moderate president when it comes to foreign affairs. Do any of you have any idea what Trump might do in the second term?
I can recommend this article called Trump's Foreign Policy Influencers. The 11 men whose worldviews are shaping the 2024 Republican ticket. And this is from Foreign Policy. And the first person listed here, Elbridge Colby, he came into the office I used to work in the Pentagon. Once I left government right before the end of the Obama administration, and then he took over the strategy office there. they're not all crazy.
That's reassuring.
But yeah, I think there's certainly a more organized approach to what a policy would be under a Trump 2 administration than there was the first time around. I mean, he's got all these people lined up, and many of them have experience in government. And I think they're really focused on competition and taking on a more protectionist American foreign policy and using American resources in a more narrow way to protect American interests.
I'd have to disagree, not because there isn't a cadre of qualified people in the wings, or who think they're in the wings, and they very well may be in the wings. But even though Trump was as shocked as anybody about his 2016 victory, perhaps with the exception of Rex Tillerson, he actually had a pretty good foreign policy, a very experienced foreign policy team. And as a banker, I don't discount Rex Tillerson's experience as having qualified him, although as an ex-State Department official, I was appalled. But the cliche, the adults in the room were there. Highly qualified. I don't think that there is a soldier today as respected as Jim Mattis, or as H.R. McMasterson. And these are people not merely of ability, but of great internal strength, who were completely discounted in the counsels of the only person Trump listens to, himself. So Colby, a very qualified guy. Is he going to have any more ability to rein in Trump's transactional focus? Because this is not a man capable of long-term thinking. Is he going to be able to control Trump's worst instincts? Is he going to be able to support his best instincts any better than Jim Mattis did?
I think the difference is, so the senior people, the ones who interacted on a daily basis with Trump in the first administration, there was nobody could rein him in. Colby wasn't at that level. So the difference I see is that Trump didn't take office with these folks having a coherent foreign policy ideology heading into office. It sort of developed, not really, but throughout, yeah. But now I think if he is elected, they know what their policy priorities are in a way that he didn't really bother thinking about them. I mean, he plucked qualified people, impressive people, and from various places and brought them into his administration the first time, and they didn't listen to any of them. But I think these people now they've been in a cohort together for a while, planning this return, planning what they want to accomplish. And so, yeah, he could very well be as unpredictable and shoot it all down as before, but I just see a more organized foreign policy effort than I saw in the first Trump administration.
Can I just say, too, so policy are ideas that people think about and agree upon and chew over and run through the process in Washington, D.C. But statecraft is the marrying of those ideas with capacity. And that takes institutions that do it, and the people institutions, and the people we deploy around the world on the ground, military, diplomatic, and development, and intelligence. And in the Middle East, the State Department is important, but our intelligence agencies really are at the leading edge of a lot of what goes on. And so when he was in office and since he's been out of office, Donald Trump has expressed great antipathy toward the CIA, great antipathy toward the Foreign Service. By the way, there have been other presidents in the past who had their own problems with the Foreign Service, so he's not alone in that, but he seems to be consistent in that. So, so these folks who are on the cover of this foreign policy article, which I did read, and I do agree with Malia, it's worth reading, to whatever their ideas are going to be, you might like them or not like them, whatever they're going to be, how are they actually going to be translated into tangible outcomes of statecraft as opposed to a new idea in a conference room in Washington. And if you don't have the institutions, there was a great book written in the 90s called Institutions Matter, and they're the very things that might be called the swamp and bureaucracy and all of those things, but guess what? That's the only way you take the policy and actually get anything done. So I think Kamala Harris is a bit of a question mark as to her stance on these sorts of things. I think it's just not been something that I've heard much of her speak about, and she hasn't said, no, I hate these institutions. That would probably not fit the moderate Democratic stream that she comes from, but I haven't really heard her articulate a consistent set of ideas about how to make these institutions work to better support the interests of the United States. So there's a question mark there, and then just sort of a mystery on the Trump side about how they would, this new group of people who, if they win, how are they going to take the ideas and make them actually work?
Well, thank you. Let's make time for one more question. You may.
So at the beginning you talked about protectionism, that currently both parties in the US are driving forward, for example, increasing tariffs. So I understand that China is aggressively subsidizing technology to destroy companies and whole markets outside China. For example, they successfully destroyed the market for solar cells and all the companies that produce them in Europe. There's no company left that produces solar cells after this war. So my question is, do you agree that on the long term, tariffs actually weakening your competitiveness of your companies in the United States?
I'm not an economic policy person. I don't know if it's true that China deliberately tried to destroy those companies. Part of the reason that Chinese technology companies have done so well is yes, the Chinese government has invested billions in these companies, but at the same time, the United States and a lot of other Western countries have failed to, until recently, try to maintain those same kind of investments. And so now we're playing a little bit of catch up and using tariffs as sort of a crutch in those catch ups. But I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion on it.
I would say this kind of is a way to just not answer the question, but to give you guidance towards somebody who did just give a long written answer to the question. Paul Krugman just had a long column in the New York Times taking on the tariff issue and specifically, saying in general, this is how they work. This is why they're generally counterproductive. But he also talks about in certain circumstances, particularly when it comes to national security, here is how they can be effective. Talking about tariffs also makes me think that another issue that I would like to hear both candidates talk about, and also any member of Congress or somebody running for Congress or Senate to talk about, which has become what I see as a great overuse of sanctions, and that sanctions are all too easy to say, like, oh, well, we're doing something. It makes us look like we're doing something, and we're using an economic tool to do this. But there's been some very good studies done on how a lot of them are also ineffective, if not also entirely counterproductive. So I know that's not what you asked, but like any good politician, I guess I would just answer another question that was on my mind.
I did see something recently that during the trade war that Trump instigated with China during his presidency, that like 285,000 American jobs were lost as a result of those tariffs. So that goes to what you're talking about.
Looks like Rick's agreeing. Well, with that, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking the panelists for the nuanced and insightful answers. I think most of you will agree we covered much more than I thought we would, given the broadness of the discussion. But thank you very much. Thanks for coming. And on the way out, please take information on the organizations. And I once again want to thank the foundation, the Dutchess Community College Foundation, and again, a wonderful organization that helped us organize this event. Please consider contributing to this important
And join the World Affairs
work.
Council.
Yes, absolutely.
And
the
vote.
World Affairs Council.
Yes, and vote.
And vote. Thank you. Have a good evening.